The October wind cut through Grace Mitchell's threadbare coat like a knife as she stood outside Henderson's General Store, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a crumpled letter of reference that had been rejected 17 times in the past month. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival often required swallowing pride. But her green eyes still held the fierce determination that had carried her through 6 months of wandering, from town to town across the Colorado Territory. What Grace didn't know, as she gathered the courage to walk into yet another establishment where she would likely face rejection and judgment, was that 50 miles away, in the remote mountain valleys of the Rockies, a solitary man named Samuel Brooks was staring out at the first snowfall of the season, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. This is the story of how desperation and hope collided in the most unexpected way, proving that sometimes the answer to our prayers comes wrapped in packages we never thought to ask. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Mitchell had never imagined that widowhood would taste like constant hunger and feel like doors slamming shut wherever she turned. 6 months earlier, she had been Grace Patterson, wife to Michael Patterson, living in a modest but comfortable home on the outskirts of Denver, expecting their first child and planning a future that seemed as solid as the Rocky Mountains themselves. Michael had been a good man, a carpenter with steady hands and an honest reputation who treated Grace with the kind of gentle respect her own father had shown her mother. Their marriage hadn't been built on passionate romance, but on mutual affection and shared values, the kind of partnership that frontier life demanded and rewarded. When Michael proposed, Grace had accepted gladly, seeing in him a chance for the stable family life she had always dreamed of. The accident that took Michael's life had been swift and senseless. A beam had given way in the mercantile building he was helping to construct, crushing him instantly, and leaving Grace to discover that the man she thought she knew had been living a carefully constructed lie. The funeral had barely ended when creditors began appearing at her door with documents that revealed the crushing truth. Michael's gambling debts exceeded the value of everything they owned combined. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," Samuel Hendricks, the bank president, had said, with what seemed like genuine regret as he reviewed the papers spread across his mahogany desk. "Your husband apparently borrowed against future earnings that simply didn't materialize. The house, the tools, even the furniture, it all has to go to satisfy his obligations." Grace had sat in that oppressive office, her pregnancy just beginning to show, trying to process how the man who had seemed so responsible and trustworthy could have gambled away not only their present, but their unborn child's future. The betrayal cut deeper than grief, leaving her questioning everything she thought she knew about judgment, trust, and the fundamental nature of the man she had shared a bed with for 2 years. "What about my condition?" Grace had asked, her hand instinctively moving to her still small belly. "Surely there's some consideration for—" "The law doesn't make exceptions for personal circumstances," Hendricks had interrupted, though his tone suggested he took no pleasure in delivering such harsh news. "You'll have 1 week to vacate the premises and remove any personal effects that aren't covered by the liens." The week that followed had been a blur of humiliation and desperate choices. Grace's parents had died in a cholera outbreak 3 years earlier, and her only living relative was a spinster aunt in Boston who had made it clear in her last letter that she considered Grace's hasty marriage a mistake that she had no intention of helping to remedy. Friends and neighbors, perhaps fearing that financial misfortune might be contagious, had offered sympathies but little concrete assistance. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, the doctor's wife who had always seemed fond of Grace, had been the most direct in her rejection. "I wish we could help, dear, but with your condition and no husband, well, it wouldn't be proper for you to stay here. People would talk, and Dr. Caldwell's practice simply can't afford that kind of scandal." The message had been clear. A pregnant widow was damaged goods, a reminder of moral failure and financial instability that respectable society preferred to keep at arm's length. Grace's condition, which should have elicited sympathy and support, instead marked her as a liability that decent families couldn't risk associating with too closely. With $11.37 in her pocket, a single suitcase containing her few remaining possessions, and the growing certainty that Denver held nothing for her but judgment and closed doors, Grace had bought a coach ticket to Colorado Springs, hoping that a larger town might offer more opportunities for employment and less scrutiny of her personal circumstances. The coach ride had been her first taste of the brutal reality that awaited pregnant women traveling alone. Other passengers had regarded her with everything from pity to open disapproval, while the driver had made it clear that any complications related to her condition would be her own responsibility. The jolting, uncomfortable journey had left her, nauseated and exhausted, but it was nothing compared to the reception that awaited her in Colorado Springs. "We don't hire women in your condition," had become the refrain that followed Grace from establishment to establishment. Shop owners, boarding house proprietors, and potential employers all delivered the same message with varying degrees of politeness. But the underlying sentiment was universal. Pregnant widows were unreliable, morally suspect, and economically unviable. Mrs. Dorothy Fairweather, who ran the most respectable boarding house in Colorado Springs, had been particularly blunt in her assessment. "Even if I were inclined to help, which I'm not saying I am, what happens when your time comes? Who pays the doctor? Who cares for the child while you work? These are practical considerations that affect everyone in my establishment." The questions had been reasonable, even if the tone had been harsh, but they highlighted the impossible situation Grace found herself in. She needed work to pay for room and board, but her pregnancy made her unemployable. She needed a place to stay to have an address for potential employment, but her lack of income made her unacceptable to landlords. The circular nature of her dilemma seemed designed to ensure that women in her situation simply disappeared, perhaps to die quietly somewhere out of sight of polite society. After 2 weeks in Colorado Springs, that had exhausted most of her remaining funds, Grace had moved on to Pueblo, then to smaller towns like Cañon City and Salida, always hoping that the next destination might offer the combination of opportunity and acceptance that continued to elude her. Each rejection had worn away a little more of her dignity and hope, until she found herself in places like Fairplay and Leadville, mining towns where desperation was common but decent employment for women was virtually non-existent. The mining camps had been particularly brutal in their assessment of her worth. "We got plenty of women here already," one saloon owner in Leadville had told her with a leer that made his meaning unmistakable. "But they ain't looking for the kind of work you'd be willing to do, especially not in your condition." The implication had been clear and disgusting, highlighting how limited society considered her options to be. In the minds of many, a woman without a husband's protection had only one commodity to offer, and her pregnancy even compromised that marketability. It was in the small town of Fairplay that Grace had encountered the most systematic cruelty of her journey. The local minister, Reverend Jonathan Hayes, had initially seemed sympathetic to her plight, inviting her to attend Sunday services and speak with him about her situation. His wife, Martha, had even offered Grace a place at their dinner table, creating the first glimmer of hope she had felt in weeks. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Reverend Hayes had intoned during their private meeting, his pale hands clasped together in an attitude of prayer. Perhaps your tribulations are meant to teach you important lessons about the consequences of poor choices. Poor choices, Grace had repeated, confused by the implication that her husband's secret gambling somehow reflected moral failures on her part. A woman's role is to be the moral compass of her household, Martha Hayes had added, her thin face pinched with disapproval. A godly wife would have recognized the signs of her husband's weakness and guided him away from temptation. Your current circumstances suggest a failure in that fundamental duty. The blame being placed on her shoulders for Michael's deception had been the cruelest cut of all. These people, who presented themselves as Christian and charitable, were holding her responsible not only for her husband's secret sins, but for every consequence that flowed from his betrayal. In their view, her pregnancy and poverty were divine. Punishment for moral failings they assumed she must have committed. "We might be able to help," Reverend Hayes had continued, "if you're willing to acknowledge your shortcomings and commit to a path of proper penitence. There's a home for wayward women in Denver that might accept you if I provided a recommendation, though you would need to surrender the child for adoption to a more suitable family." The suggestion that she give up her unborn child, the only connection she had left to anything resembling love or hope, had finally broken something inside. Grace that had been bending but not breaking through months of rejection and humiliation. She had left the Hayes household that same evening, walking out into the cold mountain air with nowhere to go, but unable to remain in the presence of such sanctimonious cruelty. Standing now outside Henderson's general store in the small town of Silverton, Grace realized that she had reached the end of her resources and perhaps the end of her options. Her remaining coins wouldn't buy another coach ticket to anywhere, and the early October weather warned of a harsh winter that she and her unborn child might not survive without shelter and steady meals. The letter of reference she carried, written by Dr. Caldwell back in Denver, had once seemed like a passport to employment and respectability. Now, after 17 rejections, it felt like evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for any place in civilized society. The paper was worn soft from handling, and the ink was beginning to fade, much like her hope of finding anyone willing to give her a chance. As she pushed open the door to Henderson's general store, the bell above her head announced her arrival with a cheerful ring that seemed to mock the desperation of her situation. Inside, the store was warm and well-stocked, with shelves full of goods that represented everything she could no longer afford: decent food, warm clothing, and the basic supplies that made civilized life possible. Thomas Henderson looked up from his ledger book as she entered, his expression shifting from polite attention to wary assessment as he took in her obvious pregnancy, worn clothing, and the careful way she carried herself, like someone trying to project confidence while teetering on the edge of collapse. "Can I help you, miss?" Henderson asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Mrs. Patterson," Grace corrected gently. "I was wondering if you might have any need for help in your store. I'm experienced with inventory, bookkeeping, and customer service. I have references." She held out Dr. Caldwell's letter with hands that she willed not to shake, watching Henderson's eyes move from her face to her belly and back again. The calculation happening behind his eyes was one she had seen too many times before, weighing her obvious need against the perceived risks of employing a pregnant woman with no husband and no local connections. Henderson accepted the letter and read it slowly, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Grace waited for what she had come to expect would be another polite but firm rejection, another door closing on her increasingly limited options. "Your references speak well of your character and abilities," Henderson said finally, handing the letter back to her. "But I'm sure you understand the practical difficulties your situation presents. When would you expect to, that is, when is your child due?" "Not until March," Grace replied, though she wasn't entirely certain of the exact date. I'm strong and capable of working until very close to my time." Henderson nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested a man wrestling with competing impulses, human sympathy and business practicality. Grace had learned to read these internal debates in the faces of potential employers, and she could see that sympathy was losing this particular battle. "I wish I could help," Henderson said at last, his tone carrying what seemed like genuine regret. "But my wife handles most of the day-to-day operations here, and she's quite particular about maintaining proper appearances. A woman in your condition working here would, well, it would create talk that might hurt business." Another door closing, another rejection delivered with polite regret but absolute finality. Grace nodded with what she hoped appeared to be gracious acceptance, though inside she felt something breaking that she wasn't sure could be repaired. She was running out of towns, running out of money, and running out of the energy needed to keep fighting for a place in a world that seemed determined to reject her. As she turned to leave Henderson's store, Grace caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hollow-cheeked, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung loosely despite her pregnancy. She looked exactly like what she had become, a woman with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, carrying a child into a world that had already made clear its judgment on their worth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The October night in Silverton cut through Grace's thin coat with a merciless cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She sat on a wooden crate behind Murphy's saloon, having been told by the bartender that she couldn't remain inside unless she was buying drinks, a luxury her remaining 73 cents couldn't afford. The alley provided some protection from the wind, but the mountain air carried the promise of an early winter that would be brutal for anyone without proper shelter. Grace pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the building, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her as if sensing her distress. The movement, which had once brought her comfort and hope, now only intensified her despair. How could she bring a child into a world where she couldn't even secure basic necessities for herself? The question tormented her as she listened to the raucous laughter and piano music drifting from inside the saloon, sounds of a world where people had enough money for entertainment while she couldn't afford a decent meal. The saloon's back door opened periodically as workers dumped kitchen scraps into barrels behind the building. Grace had watched this process throughout the evening, her hunger growing so acute that she found herself calculating whether the discarded food might still be edible. The thought of scavenging through garbage filled her with shame that burned, hotter than her physical discomfort, but her empty stomach and the baby's needs were beginning to override her pride. "You still out here, lady?" The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, the saloon's cook, a grizzled man in his 50s who had noticed Grace earlier when she'd asked about work. "You're gonna freeze to death sitting in that alley." Grace looked up at him, seeing neither sympathy nor cruelty in his weathered face, just the practical assessment of someone who had seen plenty of desperate people in mining towns. "I'll be fine," she managed, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Morrison studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her worn clothing, and the careful way she held herself despite her circumstances. "When's the last time you ate something?" The simple question nearly broke her composure entirely. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, the words barely audible above the wind whistling through the alley. Without another word, Morrison disappeared back inside the saloon. Grace assumed he had simply lost interest in her plight, but he returned, minutes later with a plate of beef stew and a chunk of bread wrapped in a clean towel. "Can't have you starving on my back step," he said gruffly, setting the plate beside her. "Bad for the establishment's reputation." Grace accepted the food with tears streaming down her face. too hungry and grateful to maintain any pretense of dignity. The stew was simple, but hot and filling, the first proper meal she'd had in 2 days. Morrison had already gone back inside, perhaps understanding that charity was easier to accept without witnesses to one's humiliation. As she ate, Grace tried to formulate some kind of plan for surviving the night and the days that would follow. The temperature was dropping steadily, and she had nowhere to go when the saloon closed. The local hotel charged $2 a night, far more than she could afford, and the boarding houses had all made their positions clear regarding pregnant women without husbands. She had passed a small church earlier in the day, and part of her wondered if she might find sanctuary there. But her experience with Reverend Hayes in Fairplay had destroyed her faith in religious charity, at least for women in her particular circumstances. Churches seemed more interested in judging moral failures than alleviating human suffering. The faint sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to see Sheriff Robert Coleman walking down the alley, his badge catching the lamplight from the saloon's windows. Grace's heart sank as she realized that even her small refuge behind the building might be denied to her. "Evening, ma'am," Coleman said, touching the brim of his hat with more courtesy than she had expected. "Jake Morrison mentioned there was someone back here who might need assistance." Grace struggled to her feet, fighting both fatigue and the awkwardness of her pregnancy. "I'm not causing any trouble, Sheriff. I was just resting for a moment." Coleman was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes that suggested he had seen enough of life's cruelties to understand them without becoming callous. "Where are you planning to spend the night?" he asked directly. The question hung in the cold air between them, like a challenge Grace couldn't answer. She had no plan beyond hoping to find a sheltered spot where she could survive until morning, then perhaps move on to another town where she might have better luck finding work or charity. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, unable to meet his eyes. Coleman nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Can't have people sleeping in alleys, especially not in this weather. Come with me." Grace's heart raced with fear that she was about to be arrested for vagrancy, but Coleman's tone seemed more concerned than authoritative. She followed him out of the alley and down Silverton's main street, passing the hotel and shops that had already rejected her earlier in the day. They stopped at a small building that served as both the sheriff's office and the town's jail. Inside, the office was warm and simply furnished with a desk, several chairs, and a wood stove that radiated blessed heat. Grace could see through an open door to 2 jail cells, both currently empty. "Sit down and warm yourself," Coleman instructed, gesturing to a chair near the stove. "Coffee's probably strong enough to dissolve horseshoes, but it's hot." As Grace settled gratefully into the chair and accepted a tin cup of steaming coffee, Coleman sat behind his desk and studied her with the same assessment she had received from dozens of other people over the past months, but his evaluation seemed to focus on her immediate needs rather than her moral shortcomings. "What's your story?" he asked without preamble. Grace found herself telling Coleman everything: Michael's death, the discovery of his debts, her months of wandering from town to town seeking work, and the systematic rejection she had faced everywhere she went. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, but offering no judgment on the circumstances that had brought her to his office. "How much money do you have left?" Coleman asked when she finished. 73 cents, Grace replied, the admission making her situation sound even more desperate than it felt. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers on his desk as if they might contain solutions to problems they had nothing to do with. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of difficult experience. "I've been sheriff in mining towns for 15 years, he said. "Seen plenty of people in bad situations, some of their own making and some just victims of circumstances beyond their control. Winter's coming early this year, and this isn't a place where people survive on the streets." The implication was clear. Without help, she and her unborn child would likely die before spring arrived in the Colorado mountains. "There's a line shack about 5 miles up Bear Creek," Coleman continued. "Used to belong to a prospector named Williams who died last winter. It's not much. 1 room, stone fireplace, roof that mostly keeps the weather out. Been sitting empty since spring." Grace felt a flicker of hope at the possibility of actual shelter, but Coleman's expression suggested there were complications she hadn't heard yet. "Problem is, it's off the main roads, and the trail gets impassable once the snow starts in earnest. If you went up there now, you'd be stuck until spring thaw, assuming you could keep warm and fed that long. The prospect of months alone, in an isolated cabin while pregnant, and with no resources, seemed almost as terrifying as freezing in Silverton's alleys." Grace had never lived anywhere more remote than the outskirts of Denver, and the thought of being completely cut off from human contact during the most difficult period of her life filled her with dread. "Is that my only option?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying her with what might have been sympathy or simple professional assessment. "Far as I can tell, it's the only option that keeps you alive through winter, unless you've got family somewhere who might take you in." Grace shook her head, thinking of her spinster aunt in Boston who had made her disapproval of Grace's marriage abundantly clear. Even if she could afford the train fare, which she couldn't, showing up pregnant and destitute would likely result in another door being slammed in her face. "What about work?" Grace asked desperately. "Surely someone in town needs help, even if it's just temporary." Coleman's expression grew darker. "Mining towns aren't kind to women in general, and they're especially hard on women in your situation. Most of the legitimate work goes to men, and the other kind." He let the sentence trail off, but his meaning was clear. The reality of her situation settled over Grace like a suffocating blanket. She had reached the end of all reasonable options and was now facing choices between different forms of potential disaster. The isolated cabin offered survival, but complete isolation during the most vulnerable period of her pregnancy. Staying in town meant facing the brutality of winter weather without shelter, likely resulting in death for both her and her child. "I need time to think," Grace said finally, though she wasn't sure what there was to think about. Coleman nodded, understandingly. "You can sleep here tonight. Got a cot in the back room that's clean and warm. Tomorrow you'll need to make a decision." The unexpected kindness nearly overwhelmed Grace's fragile composure. After months of rejection and judgment, Coleman's matter-of-fact assistance felt like a miracle, even if it only delayed rather than solved her fundamental problems. The back room contained a simple cot, a wash basin, and a small mirror that reflected a woman Grace barely recognized. Her face had grown gaunt over the past months, and her eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of too many disappointments and too little hope. She looked like what she had become, someone who had fallen through the cracks of respectable society and was barely clinging to survival. As she settled onto the cot, feeling the baby moving restlessly inside her, Grace tried to imagine what her life might look like in 6 months. If she chose the isolated cabin, she would face childbirth alone, with no doctor or midwife to help if complications arose. If she somehow survived that ordeal, she would emerge in spring with an infant, and still no prospects for employment or security. The alternative, attempting to survive winter in town, seemed even bleaker. She had already exhausted the patience and charity of everyone she had encountered, and the approaching cold would make sleeping outdoors increasingly impossible. For the first time since Michael's death, Grace allowed herself to consider whether continuing to fight was worth the agony it brought. The baby deserved better than a mother who couldn't provide basic necessities, and perhaps surrender would be kinder than subjecting an innocent child to the poverty and rejection that had become her constant companions. But even as these dark thoughts circled through her mind, something stubborn inside her refused to accept defeat. Michael's betrayal had taken away her security and social standing, but it hadn't destroyed her fundamental will to survive. The baby moving inside her represented not just responsibility, but hope, the possibility that her life might still have meaning and purpose beyond the immediate crisis. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the baby's movements and the wind howling through Silverton's streets. In her dreams, Grace found herself back in Denver, living the comfortable life she had thought was her destiny, only to wake repeatedly to the reality of her circumstances. Each awakening felt like losing Michael and her former life all over. Again, a fresh wound that never quite had time to heal. Dawn brought the sound of Sheriff Coleman moving around his office, preparing coffee and conducting the morning routines that marked the beginning of another day. Grace knew that when she emerged from the back room, she would need to make a decision that could determine whether she and her child lived or died over the coming months. The isolated cabin represented survival, but at the cost of facing pregnancy and childbirth in complete solitude. Remaining in town offered human contact, but almost certain death from exposure and starvation. Neither choice offered anything resembling hope for a better future, only different paths to enduring the immediate crisis. As she prepared to face Sheriff Coleman and make her decision, Grace realized that she had reached a point where survival itself would require more courage than she had ever needed to summon. The comfortable life she had once taken for granted seemed like a dream from someone else's existence, and the woman who had lived that life felt like a stranger she had once known but could barely remember. Standing at the crossroads between impossible choices, Grace understood that whatever happened next would either destroy her completely or forge her into someone strong enough to survive anything the world could throw at her. The next few hours would determine which version of her future would unfold. The morning sun painted Silverton's snow-dusted peaks in shades of gold and rose as Grace stood outside Sheriff Coleman's office, her meager possessions clutched in one hand and a hastily drawn map to the abandoned cabin in the other. She had made her choice. The isolated mountain refuge offered her only chance of survival through the winter, even if it meant facing childbirth alone in the wilderness. The alternative of remaining in town held no hope at all. Coleman had provided her with basic supplies, a wool blanket, matches, some preserved meat and flour that would last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. Williams left some tools and cookware in the cabin, he had explained while packing her provisions. There's a stream nearby for water, and if you're lucky, the root cellar might still have some preserved vegetables from last year. The generosity was more than Grace had expected from anyone in months, yet she understood it was also a form of exile. Coleman was helping her survive, but he was also making her someone else's problem, or more accurately, making her survival entirely her own responsibility as she prepared to begin the 5-mile trek up Bear Creek Trail. Grace noticed a commotion near Henderson's general store. A crowd had gathered around a man leading a pack train of heavily loaded mules, and even from a distance, she could see that he was unlike the typical prospectors and miners who frequented. Silverton Samuel Brooks stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor, his brown hair showing touches of gray that suggested he was somewhere in his 30s. His clothing was well-made but practical, leather boots that had seen countless mountain trails, wool pants that would turn water, and a canvas coat lined with fur. But what set him apart from other mountain men was the careful way he conducted his business and the obvious respect he commanded from the townspeople gathered around him. Fresh venison, smoked fish, and the best honey you'll taste this side of Denver, Samuel was announcing to the crowd. Also got some furniture pieces for anyone looking to improve their accommodations before winter sets in proper. Grace found herself drawn to the edge of the crowd, curious about this man who seemed to have achieved something she desperately needed: self-sufficiency in the Colorado mountains. His pack animals carried evidence of a prosperous and well-organized operation: furs, preserved foods, handcrafted items, and trade goods that spoke of someone who had mastered the art of mountain living. Thomas Henderson emerged from his store to examine Samuel's wares, and Grace overheard their conversation as she lingered at the crowd's periphery. "Haven't seen you in town since spring, Brooks," Henderson observed. "How was your summer up in the high country?" Samuel's weathered face broke into a slight smile. "Profitable enough. Had a good season hunting, and the garden produced better than expected. Managed to put aside enough stores to last through 2 winters if need be." "Still living alone up there?" Henderson asked, with the casual curiosity of someone probing for gossip. The question seemed to touch something deeper in Samuel's expression, and his smile faded slightly. "Still alone," he confirmed. "Sometimes think it might be nice to have some company, but mountain living isn't for everyone. Takes a particular kind of person to thrive up there." Grace felt a stab of longing at his words. Here was someone who had achieved exactly what she desperately needed: the ability to survive and even prosper in mountain isolation. But his comment about company suggested a loneliness that might make him sympathetic to others facing solitude. As the crowd began to disperse, and various townspeople concluded their business with Samuel, Grace found herself approaching him almost without conscious decision. Something about his demeanor, competent but not arrogant, successful but not boastful, gave her hope that he might be different from the other men who had dismissed her circumstances so readily. "Excuse me," Grace said, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind that had picked up as the morning progressed. Samuel turned toward her, and she saw his eyes take in her obvious pregnancy, her worn clothing, and the small bundle of possessions she carried. But unlike so many others, his expression didn't immediately shift to judgment or dismissal. Instead, he seemed to be assessing her with the same careful attention he had given to his business dealings. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied, touching the brim of his hat with automatic courtesy. Grace felt her carefully rehearsed words desert her as she faced this mountain man whose success represented everything she needed but couldn't achieve on her own. I heard you talking about mountain living, and I wondered." She struggled to find a way to explain her situation without immediately triggering the rejection she had come to expect. "You're the woman Sheriff Coleman mentioned," Samuel said suddenly, his tone suggesting recognition rather than judgment. "The one heading up to Williams's old place." The fact that he knew about her circumstances should have embarrassed Grace, but instead she felt relief that she wouldn't have to explain her entire story to another stranger. "Yes, that's me, Grace Patterson." Samuel studied her more intently, and Grace could see him making calculations similar to those she had witnessed in dozens of other faces over the past months. But his assessment seemed focused on practical considerations rather than moral judgments. "William's cabin is in rough shape," Samuel said finally. "Roof leaks, chimney needs work, and the door doesn't hang straight anymore. It'll keep you from freezing, but just barely." The matter-of-fact assessment confirmed Grace's fears about her winter refuge, but Samuel's tone suggested someone stating problems rather than dismissing possibilities. "I know it's not ideal," Grace replied, "but I don't have other options." Samuel nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant by that statement. "Winter comes early and hard up there. You planning to manage childbirth on your own?" The direct question about her pregnancy startled Grace. Most people either ignored her condition entirely or spoke about it in euphemisms designed to maintain polite fiction. Samuel's straightforward acknowledgement of her situation felt both refreshing and terrifying. "I'll manage," Grace said, though they both knew how inadequate that answer was. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Grace to the mountain peaks that surrounded Silverton, then back to her face. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, as if he was working through a decision in real time. "What kind of work can you do?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that Grace needed a moment to process it. After months of being told that her pregnancy made her unemployable, someone was actually asking about her skills and capabilities. "I can cook, clean, keep books, tend gardens, preserve food," Grace listed eagerly. "I managed a household in Denver for 2 years and helped with my husband's carpentry business. I learned quickly, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Those are useful skills, especially for someone living alone in the mountains." Grace felt a flutter of hope at his words, though she tried not to read too much into what might simply be polite conversation. "Are you saying you might have work for me?" "Not work exactly," Samuel replied, his expression becoming more serious. "I've got a proposition that might sound strange, but hear me out before you decide." Grace's heart began racing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. After months of rejection, any proposition felt like a lifeline, but her experience had taught her to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. "I've been living alone in the mountains for 5 years now," Samuel continued. "Built a good life up there. Solid cabin, productive land, enough resources to live comfortably. But it gets lonely, and there's work that would be easier with 2 people. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I'm not looking for hired help. I'm looking for a wife." The statement hit Grace like a physical blow, not because it was offensive, but because it was so unexpected. In all her months of desperation, she had never considered that marriage might be a solution to her problems. The idea seemed both impossible and potentially miraculous. "A wife?" Grace repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel's expression remained steady and serious. "I know it sounds sudden, but think about it practically. You need security and protection, especially with a baby coming. I need companionship and someone to help build something lasting up in the mountains. It could be a partnership that benefits both of us." Grace's mind raced as she tried to process this unexpected offer. Marriage to a virtual stranger seemed desperate and potentially dangerous, but what other option did she have? The isolated cabin offered only bare survival, while Samuel was proposing a real life with security and purpose. "But I'm pregnant with another man's child," Grace said, voicing what seemed like the most obvious obstacle to his proposal. Samuel's response was immediate and firm. "That child needs a father, and I need a family. Seems like we could solve both problems together." The simple acceptance of her situation was unlike anything Grace had experienced since Michael's death. Instead of seeing her pregnancy as a liability or moral failing, Samuel was treating it as simply another practical consideration to be addressed. "You don't even know me," Grace protested, though she could feel herself being drawn to the possibility he was offering. "I know you're strong enough to survive months of hardship without losing your dignity," Samuel replied. "I know you're willing to face winter alone in the mountains, rather than compromise your principles, and I can see in your eyes that you're a fighter, not someone who gives up when things get difficult." His assessment of her character was more generous than her own had been in recent weeks, but it reminded Grace that she had indeed survived circumstances that might have destroyed someone with less determination. "What exactly are you proposing?" Grace asked, trying to approach this conversation with the same practical focus Samuel was demonstrating. "Marry me today. Come up to my place. Help me build something good together," Samuel said simply. "I've got a cabin that's warm and secure, enough supplies to last through 2 winters, and land that produces well. You'd have security for yourself and your child, and I'd have the companionship and help I've been needing." The offer was both practical and romantic in a way that seemed perfectly suited to frontier life, where survival often required partnerships, built on mutual benefit rather than passionate love. Grace found herself considering it seriously, despite its obvious risks. "And if it doesn't work out?" she asked. Samuel's expression grew more thoughtful. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'm not given to making hasty decisions, Mrs. Patterson. I've been thinking about taking a wife for 2 years now. Seeing you today, hearing about your situation, it feels like Providence bringing us together." The mention of Providence stirred something in Grace that had been dormant since her trials began. Perhaps there was still some higher purpose guiding her life, some reason why all her previous doors had closed, only to lead her to this moment. "I need time to think," Grace said, though even as she spoke she realized that time was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sheriff Coleman expected her to leave for the cabin today, and winter was approaching with merciless certainty. Samuel nodded understandingly. "Take the time you need, but understand that if you're going to William's place, you need to leave soon. Trail gets dangerous once the afternoon storms roll in." As if summoned by his words, clouds began gathering around the mountain peaks, promising the kind of weather that could make travel treacherous or impossible. Grace realized that her moment of decision had arrived, whether she felt ready for it or not. Standing in Silverton's main street with her few possessions and facing the choice between solitary struggle and an uncertain partnership, Grace understood that her next words would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her life and her unborn child's destiny. The mountain man's unexpected proposal had transformed her impossible situation into a choice between known hardship and unknown possibility. For the first time in months, Grace faced a decision that offered genuine hope rather than simply different degrees of desperation. "Yes," Grace said, the word escaping her lips before her mind could fully process the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel's weathered face showed relief rather than joy, the practical response of a man who had solved a pressing problem rather than won a romantic prize. "Good. We'll need to find Pastor Williams and get this done before the afternoon storm." The speed with which Samuel moved to implement their agreement left Grace feeling breathless and slightly unreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold rather than living her own. Within an hour, she found herself standing in the small log church at the edge of Silverton, speaking vows to a man she had met that very morning, Pastor Daniel Williams, an elderly minister who had seen enough frontier weddings to understand that survival often trumped romance in mountain communities, performed the ceremony with dignified efficiency. Sheriff Coleman served as witness, his presence lending official weight to proceedings that might otherwise have seemed like desperate improvisation. "Do you, Samuel Brooks, take Grace Patterson to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Samuel replied, his voice steady and certain. "And do you, Grace Patterson, take Samuel Brooks to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Grace felt the baby move inside her as she prepared to answer, a reminder of the new life that would benefit from this union. "I do." The simple gold band Samuel placed on her finger had belonged to his mother, he explained quietly, as Pastor Williams, and pronounced them husband and wife. The gesture of family continuity touched Grace unexpectedly, suggesting that this practical arrangement might contain elements of genuine acceptance and belonging she had never dared to hope for. "Mrs. Brooks," Samuel said as they stepped outside the church into the crisp mountain air, and Grace felt a moment of disorientation at hearing her new name spoken aloud. The storm clouds Samuel had predicted were gathering ominously around the peaks, creating an urgency that pushed aside any opportunity for reflection on what they had just committed to. Samuel's pack train was loaded and ready for the journey to his mountain home, but the addition of Grace required some rapid reorganization of supplies and equipment. "Can you ride?" Samuel asked, as he secured her small bundle of possessions to one of the mules. "Yes, though it's been a while," Grace replied, grateful that her father had taught her horsemanship during her childhood. Though she wondered how pregnancy might affect her ability to handle a long mountain ride. Samuel helped her mount a gentle mare named Daisy, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her condition and ensuring she was comfortable before mounting his own horse, a sturdy gelding called Thunder. The pack train consisted of 6 mules carrying the supplies Samuel had traded for in town, plus additional provisions he had purchased specifically for the longer winter ahead that would now include a wife and, eventually, a child. The trail out of Silverton led steadily upward, through terrain that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they climbed toward Samuel's homestead. Grace found herself amazed by the raw magnificence of the Colorado Rockies, peaks that scraped the sky and valleys that seemed carved by giants. She had lived on the edge of these mountains in Denver, but she had never truly experienced their overwhelming scale and primal power. "How long have you lived up here?" Grace asked, as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. 5 years come spring," Samuel replied, his attention divided between the trail ahead and the storm clouds that continued to build overhead. "Came up here after my discharge from the army, looking for somewhere quiet to figure out what to do with my life." The mention of military service added another layer to Grace's understanding. "Of her new husband? Which war?" "The recent unpleasantness between the states," Samuel said, using the euphemistic term many veterans preferred to the harsher designation of civil war. "Served with Colorado cavalry, mostly fighting Indians and protecting supply lines." Grace sensed depths in his simple answer that would take time to fully understand. Men who had served in that terrible conflict often carried wounds that weren't visible, psychological scars that could affect their relationships and their ability to integrate into peaceful society. Perhaps that explained why Samuel had chosen mountain isolation over town life. As they climbed higher, the trail became more challenging, winding through forests of aspen and pine that were already showing the golden colors of early autumn. Grace marveled at the silence of the wilderness, broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves on stone and the occasional call of birds she couldn't identify. "It's beautiful," Grace said, genuinely moved by the pristine landscape surrounding them. Samuel's face showed pleasure at her reaction. "Wait until you see it in spring when the wildflowers bloom and the streams run full with snowmelt. It's like Eden up here then." The comparison to paradise struck Grace as remarkably apt, especially considering how hellish her life had become. In recent months, the transition from the desperate circumstances of morning to the overwhelming beauty of afternoon felt too dramatic to be entirely real. They had been riding for nearly 3 hours when Samuel called a halt at a clearing beside a rushing creek. The storm clouds had been tracking their progress, and the air carried the electric feel that preceded mountain thunderstorms. "We need to wait this out," Samuel explained as he began unloading rain gear from one of the pack mules. "These autumn storms can be vicious, and the trail gets treacherous when it's wet." Grace dismounted carefully, grateful for the opportunity to rest. The long ride was taking a toll on her pregnant body, and she had been trying to hide her discomfort rather than slow their progress. Samuel noticed her difficulty immediately and moved to help her settle comfortably on a fallen log beside the creek. "Should have thought to ask how you were feeling," Samuel said, his tone carrying genuine concern. "This kind of riding can't be easy in your condition." His consideration touched Grace deeply. After months of being treated as an inconvenience or moral failure, having someone express concern for her physical comfort felt like an unexpected gift. As they took shelter under a large pine tree, the storm arrived with the sudden fury typical of mountain weather. Rain fell in sheets, while thunder echoed off the surrounding peaks, creating a natural cathedral of sound and fury that left Grace awed by the raw power of her new environment. "Does it always rain this hard up here?" Grace asked, raising her voice to be heard over the downpour. Samuel smiled at her question. "Mountain storms are like everything else up here, bigger and more intense than what you're used to in town. But they pass quickly, and the air afterwards is the cleanest you'll ever breathe." As if summoned by his words, the storm began to diminish as suddenly as it had arrived. Within minutes, the rain had stopped, and shafts of golden sunlight were breaking through the clouds, illuminating droplets on pine needles like thousands of tiny diamonds. "There," Samuel said with satisfaction, "now you'll see why I love this country." The transformation was indeed spectacular. The storm-washed landscape seemed to glow with an inner light, and the air carried scents of pine, wet earth, and wild growing things that made Grace feel more alive than she had in months. For the first time since Michael's death, she found herself looking forward to what lay ahead, rather than simply dreading what might come next. They remounted and continued up the trail, which now followed the creek through increasingly spectacular country. Grace saw deer drinking at the water's edge, their heads lifting alertly as the pack train passed. Hawks circled overhead, riding thermals created by the warming air, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the haunting call of an elk. "How much farther?" Grace asked as the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that preceded sunset in the mountains. "Just over that ridge," Samuel replied, pointing to a saddle between two peaks that looked impossibly high and distant to Grace's inexperienced eyes, but Samuel's estimate proved accurate. As they crested the ridge, Grace gasped at the sight that spread before them. Samuel's homestead occupied a hidden valley that seemed like a secret world tucked away from the outside universe. A substantial log cabin sat beside a meandering creek, surrounded by cleared fields, outbuildings, and gardens that spoke of years of careful development and hard work. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brooks," Samuel said, and Grace heard genuine pride in his voice as he surveyed his domain. The cabin was larger and more sophisticated than Grace had expected, built from massive logs that had been expertly fitted and chinked. A stone chimney rose from one end, promising warmth and comfort during the long winter months ahead. The roof was made of split shakes that looked weather-tight, and the windows were real glass rather than the oiled paper she had seen in many frontier dwellings around the main house. Samuel had built a complex of outbuildings that spoke of complete self-sufficiency: a barn for livestock, a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar carved into the hillside, workshops for carpentry and metalwork, and storage buildings for the supplies and equipment that made isolated living possible. But what impressed Grace most was the evidence of care and planning that went into every aspect of the homestead. The gardens were laid out with mathematical precision, maximizing growing space while providing easy access for cultivation and harvest. Fruit trees had been planted in locations that would protect them from wind while ensuring adequate sunlight. Even the positioning of the outbuildings showed forethought, creating efficient work patterns while maintaining the aesthetic appeal of the overall complex. "You built all this yourself?" Grace asked, amazed by the scope of Samuel's achievement. "Most of it," Samuel replied modestly. "Had help with the cabin raising and some of the heavier work, but I've been improving and expanding it every year since I got here." As they approached the cabin, Grace noticed details that spoke of a man who understood that comfort was as important as functionality. The porch was wide and welcoming, with chairs positioned to take advantage of both morning and evening light. Flower boxes under the windows contained plants that were still blooming despite the advancing season. Even the pathway to the front door was carefully laid with flat stones that would provide solid footing in all weather. Inside, the cabin exceeded all of Grace's expectations. The main room was spacious and well lit, with a massive stone fireplace that would provide both heat and light during the dark winter months. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted, showing the same attention to detail that characterized the exterior buildings. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested a man who valued learning and intellectual stimulation during the long evenings of mountain winter. The kitchen area was particularly impressive, equipped with a modern cast-iron stove, ample counter space, and storage systems that would make food preparation efficient and pleasant. A large table dominated the center of the room, built to accommodate family meals and also serve as a work surface for various projects. "There's a separate bedroom through that door," Samuel said, gesturing toward the back of the cabin, "and I can build another one before the baby comes if you'd prefer separate sleeping arrangements." The delicate handling of their sleeping arrangements showed a consideration for Grace's feelings that touched her deeply. Samuel was clearly trying to make their unusual marriage as comfortable as possible, recognizing that intimacy would need to develop naturally rather than being assumed based on legal documents. As evening approached, Samuel showed Grace around the homestead, explaining the various systems and routines that kept the operation running smoothly. The complexity and sophistication of what he had created amazed her, but what impressed her most was his obvious willingness to share it all with her. "I know this is all overwhelming," Samuel said as they stood on the porch watching the last light fade from the mountain peaks. "But I want you to understand that this is your home now, not just a place where you're staying. Everything here belongs to both of us." The generosity of his statement, the complete acceptance it represented, nearly brought Grace to tears. After months of being unwanted and unwelcome everywhere she went, Samuel was offering her not just shelter, but genuine partnership in something beautiful and lasting. Standing beside her new husband in the gathering darkness of her first evening in the mountains, Grace felt the baby move inside her, as if responding to the peace and security that now surrounded them both. For the first time since Michael's death, she allowed herself to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The first weeks of November brought an early snowfall that blanketed Samuel's mountain valley in pristine white, effectively sealing Grace and her new husband off from the outside world until spring. What might have felt like imprisonment in her previous desperate circumstances now felt like sanctuary, a cocoon of safety where Grace could begin the slow process of rebuilding her sense of self and purpose. Samuel had arranged for separate sleeping quarters as promised, converting what had been his office into a comfortable bedroom for Grace. The thoughtful gesture allowed their relationship to develop naturally without the pressure of forced intimacy, though Grace found herself increasingly drawn to her husband's quiet competence and genuine kindness as the days passed. The morning routine at the homestead began before dawn, when Samuel would rise to tend the livestock and check the various systems that kept their isolated world functioning smoothly. Grace initially tried to match his early schedule, but he gently insisted that she rest as much as her pregnancy required. "The animals and I have been managing this routine for 5 years, Samuel told her when she protested about sleeping later. "Your job right now is growing that baby and getting stronger for what's ahead." His matter-of-fact acceptance of her physical needs continued to astonish Grace, who had grown accustomed to being treated as either a burden or a moral failure. Samuel approached her pregnancy with the same practical consideration he brought to every other aspect of mountain living, as a natural process that required proper preparation and support. As Grace grew more comfortable in her new environment, she began to discover talents and strengths she hadn't known she possessed. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting became an opportunity to develop skills that would have been unnecessary in town life, but were essential for mountain self-sufficiency. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher, showing Grace how to preserve meat in the smokehouse, maintain the root cellar's temperature and humidity, and manage the complex systems of food storage that would sustain them through the long winter. She learned to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the color of mountain clouds, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in their isolated location. "You're a natural at this," Samuel observed one afternoon, as Grace expertly adjusted the dampers in the smokehouse to maintain the perfect temperature for curing venison. "Most people from town never adapt to mountain living, but you seem to understand it instinctively." The praise meant more to Grace than Samuel probably realized. For the first time since Michael's death, someone was acknowledging her capabilities rather than focusing on her limitations. The confidence she had lost during months of rejection was slowly returning as she mastered each new skill and responsibility. The evenings were perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Grace's new life. While her previous existence had been filled with worry about survival and security, the nights at Samuel's homestead offered something she had never experienced: intellectual stimulation and genuine companionship. Samuel's extensive library reflected interests ranging from agriculture and engineering to history and literature, and he encouraged Grace to explore any books that caught her attention. "I haven't had anyone to discuss ideas with since I came up here," Samuel admitted one evening, as they sat before the massive stone fireplace, Grace reading a volume of poetry while Samuel worked on plans for expanding the barn. "It's nice to have someone who appreciates learning." Their conversations ranged across topics Grace had never had the opportunity to explore with Michael, whose interests had been limited to his carpentry work and local gossip. Samuel had read extensively during his military service and his years of isolation, developing perspectives on politics, philosophy, and human nature that challenged Grace to think in new ways. "What do you think about women's suffrage?" Samuel asked one evening, a question that would have been scandalous in most frontier communities but seemed natural in their private sanctuary. Grace found herself expressing opinions she had never been encouraged to voice, discovering that she had strong feelings about justice, equality, and the rights of individuals that had been shaped by her recent experiences with society's indifference to her suffering. "I think any person who bears the consequences of government decisions should have a voice in making those decisions," Grace replied, surprised by her own certainty. "My situation would have been very different if women had legal rights equal to men's." Samuel nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking this country needs more of. People who've faced real hardship understand justice better than those who've never been tested." The validation of her ideas and experiences continued to rebuild Grace's confidence in ways she hadn't expected. Samuel treated her thoughts as valuable contributions to important conversations, rather than the presumptuous opinions of someone who should know her place. As winter deepened and Grace's pregnancy advanced, she took on increasing responsibility for managing the household aspects of their operation. The kitchen became her domain, where she experimented with recipes, adapted to their available ingredients, and developed new techniques for making their stored provisions more varied and appealing. Samuel's delight in her cooking was obvious and deeply satisfying to Grace, who had always taken pride in her domestic skills but had rarely received such enthusiastic appreciation. "This is the best meal I've had since my mother died," became a common refrain that never failed to warm Grace's heart. But beyond the practical contributions she made to their daily life, Grace began to understand that she was also transforming Samuel's existence in ways that went deeper than mere convenience. The mountain man, who had lived alone for 5 years, was revealing depths of loneliness and longing for connection that he had perhaps not fully acknowledged even to himself. "I used to think I was perfectly content up here by myself," Samuel confided, one evening as they worked together to repair a broken harness. "But having you here has shown me how much I was missing. Conversation, shared work, someone to care about beyond myself. It changes everything." The admission touched Grace profoundly, not just because it validated her worth, but because it revealed that their marriage was becoming something more than the practical arrangement they had originally agreed to. Samuel was falling in love with her, and Grace was discovering that her feelings for him were growing beyond gratitude into something deeper and more genuine. The physical transformation in Grace herself was equally remarkable. The hollow-cheeked, desperate woman who had arrived in Silverton was being replaced by someone with color in her cheeks, strength in her movements, and confidence in her bearing. The mountain air, regular meals, and freedom from constant stress were allowing her body to flourish despite her advancing pregnancy. Samuel noticed these changes with obvious pleasure. "You look like a different person from the woman I met in town," he observed one morning as Grace efficiently organized supplies for the day's work. "You carry yourself like someone who knows her own worth." The comment highlighted how completely Grace's self-perception had changed. Instead of seeing herself as a burden or a failure, she was beginning to understand that she was a valuable partner in an enterprise that required her unique skills and perspectives. The baby's movements had become stronger and more frequent as winter progressed, creating a physical reminder of the new life they were building together. Samuel's excitement about becoming a father was touching and infectious, leading to long conversations about plans for their child's education and future. "This baby will grow up knowing how to be self-sufficient," Samuel said one evening as he felt the child kicking against Grace's expanding belly. "But we'll also make sure they understand literature, mathematics, and the wider world beyond these mountains." The assumption that they would raise the child together, that Samuel would be a true father rather than simply a provider, continued to amaze Grace. In frontier society, stepfathers often treated their wives' children as inconvenient additions to the family, but Samuel spoke about their unborn baby with the enthusiasm of a man anticipating his first biological child. As Christmas approached, Grace found herself experiencing joy for the first time in nearly a year. The holiday preparations in their isolated mountain home were simple but meaningful, with Samuel crafting handmade gifts while Grace worked on preserves and baked goods that would add festivity to their celebration. "I never thought I'd be this happy again," Grace admitted on Christmas Eve as they sat together watching snow fall outside their warm cabin. "6 months ago, I would have said my life was over." Samuel took her hand, a gesture that had become natural and comfortable between them. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are what lead us to the best things. If your first husband hadn't died, if you hadn't faced all that hardship, you never would have been in Silverton that day." The perspective was one Grace was still learning to accept, that her suffering had somehow been necessary to bring her to this place of contentment and security. But she could see the truth in Samuel's words, even if she couldn't yet fully embrace the idea that her previous pain had been worthwhile. The new year brought new challenges as Grace's pregnancy entered its final months. The isolation that had felt protective now became a source of anxiety as she contemplated giving birth with only Samuel to assist her. The nearest doctor was in Silverton, currently unreachable due to snow-blocked trails, and even the most experienced midwife was too far away to summon in an emergency, but Samuel's calm confidence helped steady Grace's fears. "Women have been having babies in remote locations for thousands of years," he reminded her when she expressed concerns about potential complications. "We have everything we need here. Clean water, warm shelter, and enough supplies to handle whatever happens." His practical approach to childbirth, like his attitude toward everything else in their life together, helped Grace focus on preparation rather than worry. Together, they organized supplies, studied medical texts from Samuel's library, and made plans for various scenarios that might arise during labor and delivery. The transformation in Grace's life was so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's existence. The desperate, broken woman who had begged for work in town after town seemed like a character from a story rather than her own past. In her place stood a competent, confident woman who was partner to a successful mountain man and preparing to become a mother in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Standing at her kitchen window on a February morning, watching Samuel break trail through deep snow to reach the livestock, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mountain man's simple words, "I need a wife, not a worker," had transformed not just her circumstances, but her fundamental understanding of her own worth and possibilities. The baby moved vigorously inside her, as if eager to enter the world of love and security that Samuel and Grace had built together in their hidden valley. Soon, their family would be complete, and the next chapter of their remarkable story would begin. The first sign of trouble came in early March, when Samuel discovered tracks in the snow near their eastern property line that didn't belong to any of the wildlife he knew inhabited their valley. The prints were made by shod horses carrying riders, and the deliberate pattern of their movement suggested surveillance rather than casual travel through the mountains. Samuel examined the tracks carefully, his military training evident in the methodical way he analyzed the evidence. 3 riders had approached within a quarter-mile of the main cabin before turning back, close enough to observe the homestead's layout and defenses, but not close enough to be easily spotted by its occupants. "Could be prospectors looking for new claims," Samuel told Grace that evening, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own reassuring words. "Spring thaw brings all kinds of people into the high country." Grace, now heavily pregnant and increasingly uncomfortable with the baby due any day, sensed the underlying tension in her husband's voice. Living in such close proximity for 5 months had taught her to read Samuel's moods and concerns, even when he tried to shield her from potential worries. "But you don't think that's what it was?" Grace said, her hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly as the baby shifted restlessly inside her. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he weighed how much to share with his wife so close to her time. The tracks were too organized, too purposeful. Prospectors wander randomly, looking for promising signs. These riders knew exactly where they were going and what they wanted to see. The implication hung between them like smoke from their fireplace, heavy, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. Someone had been watching their home, evaluating their situation, possibly planning something that required advanced intelligence about their isolated position. Over the next few days, Samuel increased his vigilance without making his concerns obvious to Grace. He began carrying his rifle during routine chores around the homestead, positioned it within easy reach while working indoors, and altered his daily patterns to make his movements less predictable to potential observers. But his precautions proved insufficient when the threat materialized in a form he hadn't anticipated. The visitor who arrived at their cabin on a gray March morning came alone and appeared to pose no immediate physical danger, yet his presence carried implications that were far more menacing than direct violence. Judge Theodore Whitman was a territorial official whose jurisdiction technically extended to their remote valley, though no representative of territorial government had ever bothered to visit Samuel's homestead before. Whitman was a thin, pale man in his 50s, whose expensive clothing and soft hands marked him as someone unaccustomed to frontier hardships. Yet there was a calculating intelligence in his eyes that suggested he was far from helpless. "Mr. Brooks," Whitman said as Samuel met him on the cabin's front porch, "I trust you remember me from your occasional visits to Silverton." Samuel did indeed remember Whitman, though their previous encounters had been limited to brief exchanges during Samuel's business dealings in town. The judge's unexpected appearance at the homestead, especially given the difficulty of reaching their valley in winter conditions, suggested a purpose important enough to justify considerable effort and expense. "Judge Whitman," Samuel replied, neutrally, not inviting the official inside, but not actively refusing hospitality either. "What brings you all the way up here?" Whitman's smile was practiced and entirely without warmth. "Official business, I'm afraid. There are some irregularities regarding your marriage that require clarification." The statement hit Samuel like a physical blow, not because he feared legal consequences, but because he understood immediately what Whitman's presence meant. Someone had investigated Grace's background, discovered her previous circumstances, and was now using that information as leverage for purposes Samuel could only guess at. "What kind of irregularities?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger building inside him. From his coat, Whitman withdrew a leather portfolio containing official-looking documents. "It appears your wife was involved in some questionable circumstances in Denver before her arrival in Silverton. Debts, moral complications, legal entanglements that may invalidate her right to enter into marriage contracts. The accusations were vague enough to be legally meaningless, but specific enough to create doubt and concern." Samuel recognized the tactic from his military experience, an opening gambit designed to establish leverage before revealing the actual objective. "My wife's previous circumstances are none of the territorial government's concern," Samuel said firmly. "Our marriage was performed legally by an ordained minister with proper witnesses." Whitman's expression shifted slightly, revealing a predatory satisfaction that suggested Samuel's response had been anticipated and desired. "That's where you're mistaken, Mr. Brooks. When individuals with questionable backgrounds attempt to establish legal relationships, the territory has both a right and a duty to investigate potential fraud." The conversation was interrupted by Grace's appearance in the cabin doorway. Her pregnancy was so advanced that movement had become difficult, but she had heard voices and come to investigate, despite Samuel's obvious attempt to handle the situation privately. Whitman's gaze moved to Grace, with an assessment that made Samuel's blood run cold. The judge was studying her condition, her obvious vulnerability, and the isolated nature of their location with the calculated interest of someone evaluating options for exploitation. "Mrs. Brooks," Whitman said with exaggerated courtesy, or should I say Mrs. Patterson, since there are questions about the validity of your current marital status. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that this stranger somehow knew about her previous life and was using that knowledge as a weapon against her and Samuel. The security she had built over the past months seemed to crumble around her like a structure built on sand. "There are no questions about our marriage," Samuel said, his voice carrying a warning that most men would have recognized and heeded. But Whitman was either too confident in his position or too inexperienced with truly dangerous men to properly assess the threat implicit in Samuel's tone. "I'm afraid the territorial government disagrees. There are several irregularities that must be resolved before Mrs. Patterson can legally remarry." "Such as?" Grace asked, finding her voice despite her fear and confusion. Whitman consulted his documents with theatrical precision. "Debts incurred by your previous husband that may legally encumber your person. Questions about the circumstances of his death, potential fraud in your representation of yourself as available for marriage." Each accusation was more preposterous than the last, but Samuel understood that their legal merit was irrelevant. Whitman was building a framework of official justification for whatever action he actually intended to take. "What exactly do you "What?" Samuel asked bluntly, deciding that direct confrontation might reveal Whitman's true purpose more quickly than allowing the charade to continue. Whitman's smile became more genuine, though no less threatening. "The territorial government is prepared to overlook these irregularities in exchange for certain considerations." The word considerations hung in the air between them like poison gas, carrying implications that made Samuel's military instincts scream warnings about imminent danger. "What kind of considerations?" Grace asked, though Samuel wished she had remained silent rather than encouraging Whitman to elaborate. "Your homestead occupies a strategically valuable location," Whitman explained, his manner becoming more businesslike. As he approached his real objective, "The Territorial Railroad Commission is planning routes through this region, and your valley represents a crucial link in the proposed network." The revelation transformed Samuel's understanding of the situation completely. This wasn't about Grace's past or their marriage at all. It was about seizing their land for railroad development, with Grace's supposed legal troubles serving as pretext for dispossessing them of everything they had built. "Our land isn't for sale," Samuel said flatly. Whitman's expression suggested he had expected this response. "That's unfortunate, because the alternative to voluntary cooperation is substantially less pleasant. Legal proceedings could take years to resolve, during which time Mrs. Patterson might find herself facing various criminal charges related to her previous circumstances." The threat was now explicit: surrender their property voluntarily or face legal persecution that could destroy their lives and separate their family. Samuel understood that Whitman represented interests powerful enough to manipulate the territorial court system and ruthless enough to target a pregnant woman to achieve their objectives. "How much time do we have to consider your offer?" Samuel asked, though he had no intention of accepting any arrangement that would cost them their home. "The Railroad Commission meets next week," Whitman replied. "Decisions will be made with or without your cooperation, but voluntary compliance would be much easier for everyone involved." As Whitman prepared to leave, he delivered one final warning that revealed the true scope of the threat they faced. "I should mention that the territorial government has been tracking several individuals with questionable backgrounds who have settled in remote locations. Your wife isn't the only person whose past has caught up with them." The implication was clear. Grace and Samuel weren't facing an isolated attack, but were part of a systematic campaign to remove obstacles to railroad development throughout the region. Other families, other homesteaders were facing similar pressure, creating a network of victims who shared common enemies. After Whitman's departure, Samuel and Grace sat in their cabin, trying to process the magnitude of what they were confronting. The peaceful sanctuary they had built together was now threatened by forces far more powerful and ruthless than either had imagined possible. "I'm so sorry," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "This is all because of me, because of my past." "If you had married someone without complications," Samuel cut off her self-recrimination with a gentle but firm embrace. "This has nothing to do with your past and everything to do with greed. They would have found some excuse to come after our land, regardless of who I married." But even as Samuel tried to comfort his wife, his mind was racing through the implications of their situation. Whitman's visit had been a declaration of war disguised as a legal proceeding, and the judge's confidence suggested that powerful interests were backing his actions. The railroad companies seeking to expand through Colorado territory commanded enormous resources and political influence, making them formidable opponents for isolated homesteaders. Their standard practice was to acquire needed land through any means necessary, purchase when possible, legal manipulation when purchase failed, and outright force when legal methods proved insufficient. Samuel understood that he and Grace were now facing the full weight of that corporate power, wielded by men who saw human lives and individual dreams as insignificant obstacles to profitable development. Their beautiful valley, their carefully built homestead, their growing family, all were expendable in the eyes of people who measured success only in terms of railroad miles completed and profits generated. As Grace struggled with the guilt of believing herself responsible for their troubles, Samuel began planning their defense against enemies who possessed every advantage except the one that mattered most, the determination of people fighting to protect everything they held dear. The battle for their home and their future was about to begin, and Samuel knew that the outcome would determine not just their fate, but the kind of world their child would inherit. The mountain sanctuary that had seemed impregnable was about to be tested by forces that recognized no limits in their pursuit of power and wealth. The morning after Judge Whitman's threatening visit, Samuel made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He would leave his heavily pregnant wife alone at their isolated homestead while he rode to gather allies and intelligence about the forces arrayed against them. The risk of Grace going into labor during his absence weighed heavily on his mind, but the alternative of facing their powerful enemies without support seemed even more dangerous. "I don't like leaving you," Samuel said as he prepared his horse and supplies for what could be a week-long journey through the mountains. "But we need to understand exactly what we're facing and find others who might be willing to stand with us." Grace, despite her own fears about being alone during the final days of her pregnancy, understood the necessity of Samuel's mission. "I've been through worse than being alone," she reminded him, though they both knew that giving birth without assistance would test her strength in ways her previous hardships hadn't. Samuel had spent the night studying maps and planning a route that would take him to homesteads and settlements throughout the region where other families might be facing similar pressure from railroad interests. His military experience had taught him that isolated enemies could be defeated individually, but coordinated opposition required coordinated resistance. The first stop on Samuel's journey was the Mackenzie Ranch, 15 miles to the south, where Scottish immigrants Donald and Margaret Mackenzie had built a successful cattle operation over the past decade. Samuel had traded with them occasionally and knew Donald to be a man of strong principles and considerable courage. What Samuel found at the Mackenzie place confirmed his worst fears about the scope of the railroad campaign. The ranch house windows were boarded up, the corral gates hung open, and the entire homestead had the abandoned appearance of a place hastily vacated under pressure. "They left 3 weeks ago," explained Ellen Morrison, a neighbor woman who had ridden over when she saw Samuel approaching the empty buildings. "Men came with legal papers, claimed there were tax irregularities and debts that had to be settled immediately. Donald tried to fight it, but they said he could go to jail or sell out and leave the territory." The pattern was exactly what Samuel had expected, but hoped not to find. Systematic pressure applied to isolated families who lacked the resources to mount effective legal resistance. The Mackenzies had been forced to choose between imprisonment and exile, with their life's work sacrificed to corporate interests that saw their land as nothing more than a route for railroad tracks. "Where did they go?" Samuel asked, though he suspected the answer would offer little hope for reconnecting with potential allies. "Back to family in Missouri, from what I heard," Ellen replied. Donald swore he'd never return to Colorado after what they did to him. Samuel's next stop was more encouraging. The Johansen family, Norwegian immigrants who had established a successful lumber operation in a valley 20 miles east of his own homestead, had not only resisted similar pressure, but had begun organizing other families to coordinate their defense against railroad encroachment. Eric Johansen was a bear of a man whose massive frame and intimidating presence had probably contributed to his success in standing up to territorial officials. His wife, Astrid, proved to be equally formidable, with an intelligence and organizational ability that had turned their home into an informal headquarters for resistance activities. "We've been expecting someone like you to show up," Astrid told Samuel as she served coffee and fresh bread in their kitchen, which doubled as a meeting room for planning sessions. "The pattern is too obvious to ignore. They're systematically targeting every homestead along the proposed railroad route." Eric had compiled a detailed map showing properties that had been abandoned, families that had been forced to sell under suspicious circumstances, and homesteads that were currently facing legal or economic pressure. The scope of the campaign was staggering, affecting dozens of families across hundreds of square miles of mountain territory. "The railroad companies have unlimited money and political connections," Eric explained, pointing to locations on his map where successful operations had been shut down through legal manipulation. "But they're vulnerable too, if we can organize proper resistance." The vulnerability Eric identified was public opinion and federal oversight. While territorial officials could be bought or intimidated, the railroad companies still needed approval from federal authorities who might be more responsive to evidence of systematic abuse and corruption. "We need documentation," Astrid added. "Every threatening visit, every suspicious legal proceeding, every forced sale needs to be recorded and reported to federal authorities who aren't part of the territorial political machine." Samuel shared his own experience with Judge Whitman, adding another data point to the growing evidence of coordinated persecution. But more importantly, he learned about families who had successfully resisted the pressure and methods that had proven effective in fighting back. The Hartwell family, German immigrants who operated a successful mining claim 30 miles north, had defeated attempts to seize their land by documenting every irregularity in the legal proceedings and appealing directly to federal courts. Their victory had established legal precedents that could help other families mount similar defenses. "The key is proving that territorial officials are acting beyond their authority," explained James Hartwell when Samuel visited their mountain claim the following day. "Federal law provides protections for legitimate homesteaders that territorial courts can't simply ignore if the violations are properly documented and appealed." James had studied law before immigrating to Colorado and had used his legal knowledge to identify weaknesses in the railroad company's strategy. Most of their success depended on victims being too isolated, too poor, or too ignorant of their rights to mount effective legal resistance. "They count on people being afraid and alone," James continued. "But if we can coordinate our legal challenges and share resources for court costs, we can make their campaign too expensive and too risky to continue." The strategy required not just legal coordination, but also physical security for families who chose to resist. Samuel learned that several homesteads had faced escalating pressure after refusing to sell, including mysterious fires, livestock poisoning, and direct threats against family members. The solution being organized by Eric Johansson involved establishing communication networks and mutual aid agreements between families throughout the region. If one homestead was threatened, neighbors would respond with assistance, creating a web of support that would make isolated attacks too dangerous for the railroad companies to risk. "We've set up signal stations throughout the mountains," Eric explained, showing Samuel a network of high points where mirrors and smoke signals could relay messages quickly across vast distances. "If anyone faces immediate danger, we can have armed men at their location within hours." Samuel's admiration for the organizational sophistication of the resistance network grew as he learned about supply caches, safe houses for families facing immediate threats, and even plans for coordinated legal actions that would overwhelm territorial courts with simultaneous challenges to their authority. But the most encouraging discovery was the diverse coalition of families who had joined the resistance effort. Norwegian loggers, German miners, Irish ranchers, and native-born farmers had set aside cultural differences to defend their common interests against corporate encroachment. The railroad companies made a mistake when they decided to target everyone at once, observed Sean Murphy, an Irish immigrant whose sheep ranch had successfully fought off several attempts at forced purchase. If they had picked us off one at a time, we might never have realized we were all facing the same enemy. The unity created by shared threat had overcome prejudices and suspicions that had traditionally divided mountain communities. Samuel realized that Grace and he were not isolated victims, but part of a growing movement that could potentially defeat even the powerful railroad interests. His final stop before returning home was the most dangerous, a carefully planned reconnaissance of Silverton to gather intelligence about Judge Whitman's activities and the broader railroad campaign. Samuel approached the town cautiously, using back trails and arriving after dark to minimize the risk of being recognized and reported to territorial officials. What he learned from friendly sources in town was both encouraging and alarming. The railroad companies were indeed facing growing resistance that was affecting their timeline and budget for the proposed route through the Colorado mountains. Several planned acquisitions had been delayed or abandoned due to legal challenges, and federal investigators were beginning to take interest in complaints about territorial officials' conduct. But Samuel also learned that Judge Whitman and his associates were escalating their tactics in response to the mounting resistance. Families who had successfully fought off initial pressure were being targeted for more aggressive harassment, including criminal charges based on fabricated evidence and direct threats against their physical safety. "They're getting desperate," Sheriff Coleman told Samuel during a carefully arranged midnight meeting behind the jail where Samuel had once sheltered Grace. "Word from the territorial capital is that the railroad project has to be completed on schedule, or federal funding might be withdrawn. That's making them willing to take risks they avoided before." The intelligence confirmed Samuel's growing conviction that the conflict was approaching a decisive phase where either the resistance movement would succeed in protecting homesteaders' rights or the railroad companies would crush all opposition through whatever means proved necessary. As Samuel prepared to return to his own homestead and his pregnant wife, he carried with him both hope and sobering awareness of the challenges ahead. The alliance network he had discovered offered genuine possibilities for successful resistance, but the escalating desperation of their enemies meant that the most dangerous confrontations were yet to come. The ride home through familiar mountain trails gave Samuel time to process everything he had learned and plan how to integrate his family into the broader resistance effort. Grace's pregnancy made certain forms of participation impossible, but her intelligence and skills could contribute to the documentation and communication efforts that were essential to the movement's success. More importantly, Samuel understood that they were no longer fighting alone. The isolated mountain man, who had married a desperate widow, had become part of something larger and more significant. A community of families determined to protect their homes and their futures against powerful forces that saw human dreams as obstacles to corporate profit. As he approached his valley and caught sight of smoke rising from their cabin's chimney, Samuel felt a complex mixture of relief, determination, and anticipation. Grace would soon give birth to their child, but that child would be born into a world where ordinary people were proving that they could stand together against overwhelming odds and fight for the right to build their own destinies. The alliance had been formed, the strategies had been developed, and the resources had been organized. Now came the test of whether their collective courage and determination would be sufficient to prevail against enemies who commanded vast wealth and political power, but lacked the fundamental motivation that drove people fighting to protect everything they held dear: Samuel returned to his valley just as the first labor pains began gripping Grace with an intensity that left no doubt their child's arrival was imminent. The timing seemed almost cruelly ironic. At the moment when their family was about to become complete, the forces threatening to destroy everything they had built were preparing their final assault. "The baby's coming," Grace gasped as Samuel dismounted in their front yard, her face pale but determined as she gripped the doorframe for support. "I've been having pains since dawn, and they're getting stronger." Samuel's week-long journey to build alliances suddenly seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford as he helped Grace inside and began the frantic preparations for delivering their child alone in their isolated mountain cabin. Everything he had learned about resistance networks and legal strategies would mean nothing if he lost Grace or the baby during childbirth. But Grace's strength during the long hours of labor reminded Samuel why he had fallen in love with this remarkable woman who had survived every hardship life had thrown at her. Between contractions, she insisted on hearing about his journey and the alliances he had formed, understanding that their family's future depended on the success of the broader resistance movement. "Tell me about the Johansson family," Grace requested during a brief respite between waves of pain. "Are they really organizing everyone to fight back together?" Samuel described the communication networks, the legal strategies, and the mutual aid agreements that were transforming isolated homesteaders into a coordinated force capable of challenging the railroad company's systematic land grab. As he spoke, he could see hope flickering in Grace's eyes despite her physical distress. Their son was born just before midnight on a clear March evening when the mountain stars seemed close enough to touch. Samuel had assisted at enough animal births to handle the basic mechanics of delivery, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming emotion of holding his own child for the first time. "He's perfect," Grace whispered as she cradled the baby against her chest, exhaustion and joy mingling in her voice. "What should we name him?" "Michael," Samuel said without hesitation, wanting to honor the memory of Grace's first husband while acknowledging the role his death had played in bringing them together. Michael Samuel Brooks. The choice moved Grace to tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude for a husband who understood that honoring the past could strengthen rather than threaten their future together. Little Michael's arrival seemed like a promise that their fight to protect their home and their life together was worth whatever sacrifices lay ahead. But their moment of pure family joy was interrupted 3 days later when riders approached their valley carrying news that would test every alliance Samuel had built and every plan they had made for resistance. Erik Johansson arrived with his oldest son and 2 other men from the resistance network, their faces grim with news that meant the final confrontation was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality. "Judge Whitman isn't waiting for legal processes anymore," Erik reported as the men gathered around Samuel's kitchen table while Grace nursed their newborn son nearby. "He's got federal marshals with him now, claiming emergency authority to seize properties for national defense purposes." The escalation represented a fundamental change in tactics that threatened to overwhelm the legal strategies the homesteaders had developed. Emergency authority could bypass normal court procedures and property rights, making their carefully documented appeals meaningless if Whitman could convince federal officials that railroad construction was essential for national security. "How many marshals?" Samuel asked, his military training automatically focusing on tactical considerations. "6 that we've counted, plus Whitman's own men," replied Lars Johansson, Erik's 18-year-old son, who had been serving as a scout for the resistance network. "They're moving from homestead to homestead with immediate eviction orders, giving families 1 hour to gather personal belongings before seizing everything else." The systematic nature of the assault confirmed Samuel's worst fears about their enemy's desperation and resources. The railroad companies had clearly decided that legal niceties were obstacles they could no longer afford, and they were prepared to use federal authority to crush any resistance. "Who have they hit so far?" Samuel asked, though he suspected the answer would include families he had met during his alliance-building journey. Eric's expression darkened further. The Murphy Ranch was first. They burned the house after Sean refused to leave voluntarily. The family barely escaped with their lives. Then they hit the German settlement near Bear Lake, claiming mineral rights superseded homestead claims. Each successful seizure made the remaining homesteaders more vulnerable by isolating them from potential support and demonstrating the futility of individual resistance. Samuel understood that their carefully built alliance network was being systematically destroyed unless they could find a way to coordinate an effective response. "We need to make a stand somewhere," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led soldiers in battle. "If we let them pick us off one by one, we'll all lose everything." Eric nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we came to. Discuss. Your valley is the most defensible position in the region, and your military experience makes you the logical choice to coordinate our resistance." The proposal meant turning their home into a fortress and their newborn son's first weeks of life into a war zone. But Samuel could see no alternative that offered genuine hope of protecting their family and their community. Grace, overhearing the conversation while tending to baby Michael, made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Then we make our stand here," she said firmly, her voice carrying the strength of a woman who had survived every form of adversity and emerged stronger. "This is our home, our land, our life. If we're going to fight, we fight for what matters most." Her determination settled the question for Samuel and provided inspiration for the other men who had been wavering about the risks of direct confrontation with federal authority. If a woman who had just given birth was willing to defend their community, how could they do less? The preparations that followed transformed Samuel's peaceful homestead into the headquarters of a resistance movement that would determine the fate of every homesteader in the Colorado mountains. Families from throughout the region began arriving with their most essential possessions, creating a refugee camp that doubled as a military encampment. Astrid Johansson took charge of organizing supplies and communications, her efficiency and intelligence proving invaluable as dozens of families needed food, shelter, and coordination of their defensive efforts. Grace, despite having given birth just days earlier, insisted on contributing to the preparations by helping organize medical supplies and coordinating care for the children who were now at risk due to their parents' decision to resist. The defensive. Preparations drew on Samuel's military experience, but were adapted to the unique circumstances of mountain warfare and the mixed civilian-military nature of their forces. Trenches and barricades were positioned to take advantage of the valley's natural features, while lookouts were posted at strategic points to provide early warning of approaching enemies. But the most crucial element of their defense was the legal documentation that James Hartwell had insisted on maintaining throughout their resistance efforts. Every illegal seizure, every violation of federal homestead law, every abuse of emergency authority was being recorded and transmitted to sympathetic federal officials who retained the power to override territorial corruption. The railroad companies are making a fundamental mistake, James explained during one of the strategy sessions that preceded the expected assault. They're assuming that federal authority automatically supports their interests, but federal law actually protects legitimate homesteaders against exactly this kind of abuse. The legal strategy required surviving long enough for federal intervention to take effect, but it offered hope that their resistance might succeed through legitimate channels rather than through violence that could destroy innocent families. Judge. Whitman's forces appeared on the ridges surrounding Samuel's Valley on a bright April morning, when spring wildflowers were blooming and the air carried the promise of renewal and growth. The timing seemed symbolic. Corporate greed and government corruption attempting to destroy new life and hope at the very moment when nature was demonstrating the power of regeneration. Samuel counted 12 riders approaching under a flag of truce, though the military bearing of half the group suggested that negotiation was not their primary intention. Judge Whitman rode at the center of the formation, his pale face showing strain and anger that indicated the resistance movement had disrupted his plans more than he had anticipated. "Mr. Brooks," Whitman called out as the riders stopped just outside rifle range of the defensive positions the homesteaders had prepared. "You are harboring fugitives from federal justice and interfering with legitimate government operations." Samuel stood on his front porch with his rifle visible, but not immediately threatening, flanked by Eric Johansson and James Hartwell, in a display of unity that demonstrated the breadth of support for their resistance. "Judge Whitman," Samuel replied, his voice carrying clearly across the valley, "you are trespassing on legally claimed homestead land and threatening families who have committed no crimes except refusing to surrender their property to railroad companies." The exchange that followed revealed the fundamental conflict between two completely different visions of law and justice. Whitman represented a system where corporate interests could manipulate government authority to seize whatever they desired, while Samuel and his allies stood for the principle that individual rights and legitimate property claims deserved protection from corruption and abuse of power. "I have federal authority to seize this property for national defense purposes," Whitman declared, producing documents that appeared official but which James Hartwell immediately identified as fraudulent. "Your documents are forgeries," James called out, his legal training evident in his confident analysis of Whitman's papers. "Federal emergency authority requires specific documentation that you don't possess, and homestead law provides protections that can't be overridden by territorial officials." The legal challenge created exactly the situation Whitman had hoped to avoid: public exposure of his methods by someone qualified to identify their illegalities. His response revealed both his desperation and his fundamental miscalculation about the character of the people he was threatening. "Surrender now or face the consequences of resisting federal authority," Whitman warned, though his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed during his earlier visit to Samuel's cabin. Samuel's response came not in words, but in actions that demonstrated the unity and determination of the homesteader community. From positions throughout the valley, men and women emerged to stand visibly in defense of their homes and their rights. The display was not threatening, but it was unmistakably resolute. These families would not be intimidated into surrendering everything they had worked to build. The standoff that followed lasted for hours, with neither side willing to initiate violence, but both understanding that the conflict had reached a point where retreat was impossible. Samuel used the time to observe Whitman's forces and confirm his assessment that several of the supposed federal marshals were actually railroad company enforcers with no legitimate authority. The resolution came from an unexpected source: genuine federal officials who arrived in response to the legal appeals and documentation that the resistance movement had been filing for weeks. A telegram from the territorial governor, responding to pressure from Washington, ordered Whitman to cease all seizure activities pending federal investigation of corruption allegations. Judge Whitman's defeat was complete and public, witnessed by dozens of families who would spread the story throughout the territory and beyond. The railroad company's systematic land grab had been exposed and stopped, their corrupt local officials had been repudiated by higher authority, and the homesteaders' rights had been validated by the federal government itself. As Whitman's forces retreated from the valley, Samuel felt Grace's hand slip into his as they stood together watching their enemies disappear into the distance. Their newborn son slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that his first weeks of life had coincided with a victory that would protect his future and the futures of countless other children throughout the Colorado mountains. 5 years had passed since the dramatic confrontation in Samuel's Valley, and the Colorado Territory had transformed in ways that reflected the broader changes sweeping across the American West. The railroad had eventually been built, but through routes that respected existing homestead claims, rather than trampling over the rights of established families. Judge Whitman and several of his associates had been prosecuted for corruption, their convictions sending a clear message that federal law would protect legitimate settlers against corporate manipulation. Grace stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching her son Michael chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow that had become his favorite playground. At 5 years old, he possessed his father's steady confidence and his mother's quick intelligence, but more importantly, he carried himself with the unconscious security of a child who had never known hunger, abandonment, or the fear that tomorrow might bring disaster. The transformation in Grace herself was equally remarkable. The desperate, hollow-eyed woman who had begged for work in town after town seemed like a character from someone else's story when Grace looked back on those dark months before Samuel had changed her life forever. She had grown into her role as the wife of one of the territory's most respected ranchers and the mother of a growing family that now included 2-year-old Sarah, whose arrival had filled their home with laughter and constant activity. But perhaps, more significantly, Grace had discovered talents and purposes she had never imagined during her years of conventional married life in Denver. Her experiences during the homesteader resistance had revealed organizational and leadership abilities that made her a natural advocate for other families facing hardship and injustice throughout the territory. The kitchen table where she and Samuel had once planned their defense against Judge Whitman's forces now served as the headquarters for the Colorado Homesteader Protection Association, an organization Grace had founded to help isolated families navigate legal challenges and access resources for building successful mountain operations. Her own journey from desperate widow to prosperous ranch wife had given her unique credibility with women facing similar circumstances, while her partnership with Samuel demonstrated that unconventional marriages could create stronger foundations than traditional arrangements. "Mrs. Brooks," called Emma Patterson, a young widow who had arrived that morning seeking assistance with a land dispute. "I can't tell you how grateful I am for your help. The lawyers in town said my case was hopeless, but you've shown me legal precedents that prove they were wrong." Grace smiled as she reviewed the documents Emma had brought, recognizing familiar patterns of intimidation and legal manipulation that echoed her own past experiences. "The law is actually quite clear about protecting widows' property rights," Grace explained, "but you have to know which statutes to cite and how to present your evidence properly." The work was deeply satisfying because it allowed Grace to transform her own painful experiences into practical help for other women facing similar challenges. Every successful case they handled established precedents that made it easier for future widows to protect their inheritance and their children's security. Samuel emerged from the barn, where he had been working with their newest hire, Tom Wilson, a young man whose family had been among those helped by the Homesteader Protection Association. The success of their organization had created unexpected opportunities for employment and community building, as families who received help often chose to settle in the area where they could continue benefiting from the support network Grace and Samuel had developed. "The Patterson woman is here about the land dispute near Durango," Samuel observed as he joined Grace on the porch, automatically checking to ensure Michael was still safely visible in the meadow. "Emma Patterson," Grace corrected gently, and her case is actually quite straightforward once you understand the relevant statutes. Her late husband's business partner was trying to claim assets that legally belonged to her and her children. Samuel nodded approvingly. His wife's expertise in territorial law had grown sophisticated enough to impress lawyers and judges throughout the region, though Grace herself remained modest about knowledge that had been earned through necessity rather than formal education. The afternoon brought their weekly visitor, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had established a medical practice serving the scattered homesteads throughout their region. Dr. Morrison was among a growing number of professional women who had discovered that the frontier offered opportunities for independence and career advancement that would have been impossible in more established Eastern communities. "How are my favorite patients?" Dr. Morrison asked as she examined both children with the thorough attention that had made her one of the territory's most trusted medical practitioners. "Michael is reading books intended for children twice his age," Grace reported proudly. "And Sarah has decided she wants to learn to ride as soon as she can walk steadily. Both excellent signs of healthy development," Dr. Morrison observed. "Children who grow up in secure, stimulating environments tend to develop confidence and curiosity that serve them well throughout their lives." The comment highlighted something Grace had observed about her own children and others in their community. Kids who were raised by parents who had overcome significant challenges seemed to inherit strength and resilience that prepared them for whatever obstacles they might face in their own futures. As evening approached, Grace and Samuel settled into their favorite routine of sitting on their expanded porch while the children played nearby, and the mountain sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors. These quiet moments together had become precious opportunities to reflect on their remarkable journey and plan for the future they were still building together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sheriff Coleman had decided to arrest me for vagrancy that night in Silverton?" Grace asked, a question that had occasionally crossed her mind during particularly peaceful moments like this one. Samuel considered the hypothetical scenario seriously. "I think I still would have found a way to help you," he said finally. "Maybe. Not marriage, but I couldn't have walked away from someone in your situation. It wouldn't have been right." The response was typical of Samuel's character, practical, honest, and revealing of the moral principles that had guided his decision to propose marriage to a desperate stranger. Grace had learned over their years together that his offer hadn't been impulsive, but had reflected deep convictions about justice, compassion, and the responsibilities people had toward each other. "I'm glad it worked out the way it did," Grace said softly, her hand finding his as they watched Michael carefully helping his younger sister navigate the porch steps. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eric Johansson, whose visits had become monthly traditions since the successful resistance against Judge Whitman's forces. Eric's lumber operation had prospered enormously in the years since the railroad's completion, as demand for construction materials had created opportunities for legitimate businesses throughout the territory. "Brought you some interesting news." "Home from town," Eric announced as he dismounted and accepted Grace's offer of coffee and fresh pie. "Federal investigators are recommending that Colorado be granted statehood within the next 2 years, partly because of how well territorial residents have organized to protect their rights and build stable communities." The news was significant because statehood would provide additional legal protections for homesteaders while reducing the influence of corrupt territorial officials who had made life difficult for independent families. It also represented validation of everything the homesteader resistance had fought to achieve, recognition that ordinary citizens could organize effectively to defend their rights and build the kind of communities they wanted to live in. "Who's being mentioned as potential governors once statehood is approved?" Samuel asked, his interest reflecting the political engagement that had developed naturally from their experiences with territorial corruption. Eric's smile suggested he was saving the best news for last. "Your name keeps coming up, Samuel. Apparently, your role in organizing the homesteader resistance has impressed people throughout the territory, and they're looking for leaders who have proven they can't be bought or intimidated." The suggestion that Samuel might become Colorado's first state governor was both exciting and daunting, representing opportunities to implement the principles they had fought for while accepting responsibilities that would affect thousands of families throughout the region. Grace's reaction was immediate and supportive. "You should seriously consider it," she told her husband. "You've already proven you can bring people together to fight for what's right, and Lord knows this territory needs honest leadership." The possibility opened up visions of a future neither Grace nor Samuel had imagined when they stood together in Pastor William's small church, speaking vows to a virtual stranger. From desperate widow and isolated mountain man, they had become partners in building something much larger than their individual happiness, a model of community organization and principled leadership that could influence the development of an entire state. As they discussed the implications of potential political involvement, Grace found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The pregnant widow who had begged for work in every town, facing rejection and judgment at every turn, had become a respected advocate and the wife of a man being considered for the highest office in their future state. Michael ran up to the porch with a handful of wildflowers he had picked for his mother, his face glowing with the simple joy of a child who had never known anything but love, security, and encouragement. Behind him, little Sarah toddled determinedly, refusing help, but accepting the steadying hand Samuel offered when she stumbled. "These are beautiful, sweetheart," Grace told her son as she accepted his floral offering. "Should we put them in water so they last longer?" As they prepared the flowers for display, Grace caught Samuel watching their family scene with an expression of deep contentment and quiet amazement, as if he still couldn't quite believe that the solitary mountain man he had been was now surrounded by the warmth and chaos of a thriving family. "No regrets?" Grace asked softly, a question they had asked each other periodically throughout their marriage. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Samuel replied, the same answer he had given every time she posed the question, though it never failed to warm her heart. Standing on their porch, in the gathering twilight, surrounded by their children and looking out over the valley they had defended and the community they had helped build, Grace understood that her story had become something far different from anything she could have imagined during those desperate months of wandering from town to town. The mountain man who had said, "I need a wife, not a worker," had offered her much more than employment or even marriage. He had given her the opportunity to discover who she could become when someone believed in her potential, rather than judging her circumstances. Their love story had begun with practical necessity and mutual benefit, but it had grown into something that had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire community around them. The desperate bargain struck in Silverton's Main Street had become the foundation for a family, a movement, and potentially a political legacy that could influence generations of Colorado families. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, above their mountain valley, Grace Brooks, no longer Patterson, no longer a desperate widow begging for work, held her husband's hand and watched their children play in the security and love they had built together. The woman who had once had nowhere to go and no one to turn to had found not just a home, but a purpose that would continue growing as long as there were families needing protection and communities needing principled leadership. The mountain man's simple invitation to come home with me instead had indeed brought her home, not just to a place, but to a life of meaning, love, and service that honored both the suffering that had shaped her and the strength that had sustained her through every trial. Their story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for whatever adventures and challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.